What we're diving into today really challenges how we think about what makes nations rich or poor, based on some truly eye-opening ideas from Daron Acemoglu and James A. Robinson's book, Why Nations Fail.
For anyone who thinks, a country's economic fate is mainly down to geography or maybe culture, this book has what the authors call bad news. Their central argument is that it's actually man-made institutions, the rules, the laws, the way society is organized, not the land itself or ancient traditions, that really determine if a country is prosperous or poor.
Okay, let's unpack this a bit to really illustrate this powerful idea. The authors kick off with a place called Nogales, but not just one Nogales. Two, one in Arizona, USA, and one right across the border in Sonora, Mexico. Imagine a city literally split by a fence.
Exactly. And physically, they're pretty much the same place. Same geography, same climate. The people even share ancestors, food, music, that kind of thing.
Yet the day-to-day reality is vastly different.
Absolutely stark. In Nogales, Sonora, average household income is what? About a third of what it is in Nogales, Arizona. You see lower high school graduation rates, much higher infant mortality, poor public health. Roads aren't great, crime's a major issue, and trying to start a business. It's a nightmare of bureaucracy and, frankly, corruption.
Wow. And that contrasts so sharply with the U.S. side.
It really does.
So what does this tell us? I mean, the obvious question is, how could two places so similar on the surface be so incredibly different economically?
And the authors point straight at the institutions. Nogales, Sonora, for instance, until the year 2000, was under the control of the Institutional Revolutionary Party, the PRI, known for being pretty corrupt, just like most of Mexico back then. So that right there gives you a big clue about the core argument we're exploring today.
Right. It's all about the incentives these institutions create, and crucially, how politics shapes those institutions in the first place.
Precisely. And this idea directly challenges those other common explanations, like the geography hypothesis or the culture hypothesis.
Let's tackle geography first. How do they argue against that?
Well, they point to the reversal of fortune in the Americas. Before Columbus, before 1492, civilizations in Mexico, Central America, the Andes, they were way ahead technologically, higher living standards than North America. The geography didn't change, but the institutions the European colonists imposed, those created widespread poverty in those previously prosperous areas.
That's a powerful point. Any other examples?
Sure, think about the Middle East. It led the Neolithic Revolution, was technologically dynamic even into the Middle Ages. Its current relative poverty isn't really about the geography. The authors argue it's much more about the institutional legacy, particularly from, say, the Ottoman Empire.
Okay, so geography doesn't seem to hold up under scrutiny. What about culture? That's a common one you hear.
Yeah, the culture argument. The book uses the Kingdom of Congo as a really vivid counterexample. Late 15th century, Congo was a major centralized state, bigger than London at the time. They learned about the wheel and the plow from the Portuguese, but didn't adopt them for farming, even though the Portuguese tried to help with agricultural missions.
So they weren't interested in the technology.
Not that technology. What they did adopt very quickly was the gun. Why? To capture and export slaves. So it shows their culture wasn't inherently anti-technology. It's just that the incentives, shaped by the elite wanting to profit from the slave trade, dictated which technologies got adopted. Guns were useful for extraction, plows weren't for them.
So any cultural differences we might see today are more likely a result of institutions, not the cause.
That's the argument. Culture follows institutions, not the other way around.
Okay, so if it's not geography or culture, it has to be these institutions you mentioned. The book talks about two main types, inclusive and extractive. What's the core difference there?
Right. Inclusive institutions are the ones that encourage lots of people, the broad mass of society, to participate in economic life. They do this by protecting property rights, making sure there's a level playing field, encouraging education and innovation, think open markets, rule of law.
Yeah, and
Extractive institutions are basically the opposite. They're set up to allow a small elite to extract wealth and resources from the rest of society. They actively suppress innovation and broad participation because that could threaten the elite's grip on power and wealth.
Now, here's where it got really interesting for me. The book talks about growth under extractive institutions. It can happen, but it's different, right? And often short-lived.
Absolutely. The Soviet Union is a classic, if tragic, example. Under Stalin, they abolished private property. forced collectivization in agriculture, used the state's power command economics to pour resources into heavy industry. And initially, yeah, they saw rapid growth, partly because they were playing catch up with existing technologies, and partly because they just forcibly moved labor from farms to factories, even if it was inefficient.
But the incentives for individuals, they weren't there.
Exactly. There was no real incentive for individual effort, for coming up with new ideas, for using resources efficiently. It was all driven by targets and coercion.
And the human cost, staggering.
Yeah.
Millions dead from famine, hundreds of thousands executed or exiled. The source mentioned, 36 million guilty verdicts for labor violations between 1940 and 55, and 250,000 shot.
It's horrific. You can force someone into a factory, but you can't force genuine creativity or hard work that way. Not sustainably. And look what happened. When Gorbachev tried to reform, to move away from that pure extraction after 1987, the whole system crumbled. The Communist Party lost control. The Soviet Union collapsed.
So that kind of growth, it just doesn't last, because it kills the very things needed for long-term prosperity, like creative destruction and real innovation.
Precisely. It lacks dynamism.
The book gives other examples too, right?
Yeah.
Like the Kuba Kingdom.
Yes, under King Shyam. There was some prosperity because he imposed law and order, which facilitated extraction, but again, no real innovation engine. And even going further back, the Maya city-state of Copan, huge population for its time, bigger than London or Paris then.
But it collapsed.
Collapsed under its extractive system. We see evidence like monuments being defaced, the elite eventually just disappearing. The system couldn't sustain itself.
And Rome.
Yeah.
Even the mighty Roman Empire fits this pattern.
To an extent, yes. There's fascinating evidence from Greenland ice cores analyzing layers of ice. They show a big spike in pollutants like lead, silver, copper, starting around 500 BC, peaking in the 1st century AD.
Indicating mining, economic activity.
Intense Roman mining and economic expansion, yes. But that growth also seems to have been unsustainable. Wealth got super concentrated with a few senatorial families, huge estates, latifundia, worked by slaves. Inequality soared. Plutarch wrote about Tiberius Gracchus lamenting this inequality and the social unrest it caused.
And when Rome pulled out of places like Britain.
After 411 AD in England, all the signs of prosperity vanished. Use of money dropped off, cities declined, they stopped using mortar and tiles, even literacy plummeted. The extractive foundation couldn't support prosperity without the imperial structure.
Okay, so if institutions are key, and they can be extractive or inclusive, how do these differences even arise? The book points to small differences meeting critical junctures.
That's a core part of the argument. History matters, but it's not deterministic. Small initial differences between societies can be magnified enormously when they encounter a major shock or change a critical juncture.
Like the Black Death.
Exactly. The Black Death in the 14th century wiped out maybe half of Europe's population. Huge shock, created a massive labor shortage everywhere. Now, in England, the initial reaction from the top, King Edward III, was the Statute of Laborers in 1349 trying to freeze wages, force people to work.
Did it work?
Largely failed. The labor shortage was too severe. Peasants had more bargaining power. The long-term result in England was a weakening of serfdom, fewer feudal restrictions. People became more mobile, more empowered. This laid some crucial groundwork unintentionally for more inclusive institutions later on. In Eastern Europe, by contrast, the same Black Death led elites to tighten their grip on serfs. Different initial conditions, different outcomes from the same shock.
And then European colonization, another huge critical juncture, especially for the Americas.
A massive one.
Yeah.
And it created completely divergent paths. The Spanish arrived focused on finding gold, silver, and large populations they could exploit for labor.
Like the Aztecs and Incas.
Right. Their model, perfected by Cortez in Mexico and Pizarro in Peru, was capture the leader, grab the wealth, and then take over the existing tribute and forced labor systems, like the Inca Mito. This directly led to setting up highly extractive institutions. The Potosi silver mine Mita system lasted until 1825. Systems like the encomienda, the repartimiento in places like Guatemala, basically forms of forced labor and resource extraction for the Spanish crown and colonial elite.
And did that change after independence in Guatemala, for example?
Not fundamentally, no. After independence, the new liberal elite actually intensified forced labor systems. You had the repartimiento revived as forced labor drafts, and the libreta, a workbook system that trapped workers in debt peonage. They passed vagrancy laws, forcing indigenous people to work for low wages, especially on the big coffee estates owned by the elite.
Wow, so independence didn't mean inclusion.
Not there. President Jorge Ubico in the 1930s and 40s even banned words like workers or unions to crush any opposition. It completely stifled any chance of broader industry or creative destruction because it threatened the elite's control over cheap labor. The extractive nature persisted just under new management.
The Carlos Slim example fits here, right? Showing how those institutions still operate.
It's a modern illustration, yes. He built his fortune in Mexico largely through political connections, monopolies like Telmex, and using legal loopholes like the Amparo to kind of shield himself from competition or equal application of the law.
But they didn't work in the U.S.
Nope. When his company Grupo Carso broke a contract in the U.S., they got hit with a huge $454 million judgment in a Dallas court. No amparos there. It shows how different institutional environments enforce rules differently, even for the very wealthy.
So the Spanish got the regions with dense populations and precious metals. What about the English in North America?
They essentially got the leftovers. They arrived later. The places the Spanish wanted were already taken. Early Jamestown settlers, led by Captain John Smith, were initially looking for gold too, but they quickly realized it wasn't there. And crucially, the local Native American populations weren't large centralized empires suitable for the Spanish model of exploitation. Smith noted, "Victuals, you must know, is all their wealth." There was no gold, no existing forced labor system to take over.
So they had to work themselves.
Pretty much. Smith famously imposed the rule, "He that will not work shall not eat." He wrote back to the Virginia Company, begging them to send farmers, carpenters, blacksmiths, useful workers, not more useless goldsmiths. This completely different starting point pushed the English colonies towards needing to incentivize the colonists themselves to work and invest, leading down a path toward more inclusive economic institutions over time. Property rights, some political representation, these became necessary to attract and keep settlers.
Which leads us eventually to another pivotal moment, this time back in England, the Glorious Revolution of 1688.
Yes, a huge turning point. The Glorious Revolution really marked the end of royal absolutism in England. It was the culmination of a long power struggle between Parliament and the monarchy. You had earlier steps like the Statute of Monopolies in 1623, limiting the king's power to grant exclusive business rights. But 1688 solidified Parliament supremacy.
And what did that mean institutionally?
It meant Parliament now controlled state policy. They started promoting the interests of merchants, manufacturers, strengthening property rights more broadly, getting rid of arbitrary taxes, and actively using state power like the Navy to protect and promote commerce. It shifted power away from the narrow circle around the king.
And this is why the Industrial Revolution kicked off in England. It wasn't just luck.
The authors argue forcefully it was not luck. It was a direct result of these increasingly inclusive economic institutions that the Glorious Revolution helped secure. Property rights were more secure, financial markets were developing, barriers to entry in industry were lower, so inventors like James Watt, steam engine, Richard Arkwright, water frame, they had confidence their inventions would be protected, they could access markets, raise capital, and crucially, they were responding to economic incentives and demand.
You mentioned Watt's letter.
Right, in 1775, he wrote to his father, excited because Parliament had just passed an act granting him a patent on his improved steam engine for 25 years, specifically because there was considerable demand. That direct link between innovation, property rights secured by Parliament, and market demand. That's the engine of the Industrial Revolution.
But this process, this creative destruction, wasn't welcomed everywhere, was it? Elites in other countries resisted.
Absolutely not. Creative destruction, as Schumpeter called it, inherently disrupts the existing order. It creates losers, often the established elites, as well as winners. So in places like Russia, Nicholas I and his finance minister, Count Cancrin, actively opposed industrialization. They feared things like railways would create social upheaval, give workers too much mobility, potentially stir up unrest like the Decembrist revolt they'd already seen.
They preferred stability, even if it meant stagnation.
They preferred the stability of the existing extractive system, which benefited the landed aristocracy. They deliberately hindered industrial development to protect the status quo. Same thing in Austria-Hungary under Francis I. He also feared creative destruction, blocked railway construction initially, blocked factory formation, all to preserve the power of the traditional elites and prevent the rise of a potentially challenging middle class or organized working class.
Okay, another critical juncture then seems to be the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars that followed. How did that change things?
Radically, across much of continental Europe. The French armies, both revolutionary and Napoleonic, didn't just conquer territory, they exported their revolution. Wherever they went, they typically abolished feudalism, got rid of the restrictive guilds, eliminated the legal privileges of the nobility and clergy, and imposed the Napoleonic Code, which enshrined principles like equality before the law.
So they forcibly installed more inclusive institutions.
Essentially, yes. They swept away the old extractive structures in places like the Rhineland, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, Switzerland. And it was in these areas that industrialization started to take hold much faster after Napoleon's defeat. Countries that weren't occupied and reformed by the French, like Russia and Austria-Hungary, largely kept their old extractive institutions and lagged behind economically. It shows the powerful impact of institutional change, even when imposed from outside.
Let's shift to Asia. How did this play out with, say, China and Japan facing the rise of the industrial West in the 19th century?
That's a fascinating comparison because both started poor and under absolutist rule. China was a huge centralized empire. For centuries, its emperors had been suspicious of merchants and foreign trade, seeing them as potential threats to stability and their rule. The Ming dynasty famously curtailed Zheng He's voyages, for instance. There wasn't really an institutionalized way for opposition or alternate power centers to push for fundamental reform from within.
Japan was different.
Yes, Japan's political structure was different. You had the emperor, but real power lay with the Tokugawa shogun. And importantly, there were powerful, semi-autonomous feudal domains like Satsuma and Shoshu. Within these domains, leaders like Ukubo Toshimichi and Satsuma realized, especially after seeing Western power, that Japan needed fundamental change to survive, let alone prosper. They saw the need to abolish feudalism, embrace trade, build a modern army and state.
So they led the change from within.
They did. These leaders from Satsuma and Chushu drove the Meiji Restoration in 1868, overthrowing the shogun and embarking on a rapid state-led modernization program. They consciously adopted and adapted inclusive institutions, ending the samurai class privileges, creating a conscript army, promoting industry.
While China,
lacking that kind of internal political dynamic that could force radical change, mostly tried to just import Western weapons, the self-strengthening movement, without fundamentally changing its institutions. It wasn't enough. Japan industrialized rapidly. China largely stagnated until much later.
So it seems these different institutional paths, once started, can become self-reinforcing. The book calls these virtuous and vicious circles.
Exactly. That's a key concept. The virtuous circle works like this. Inclusive political institutions tend to support inclusive economic institutions. These generate wealth more broadly. That broader prosperity then empowers more people to demand even more inclusive political institutions, creating a positive feedback loop.
Like the progression in Britain after 1688.
Right. Britain didn't just stop with the Glorious Revolution. There was continued pressure for more political inclusion. Think about the Chartist movement in the 1830s and 40s demanding universal male suffrage, secret ballots, things like that. While the Chartists themselves failed initially, the pressure led to gradual reforms. The Great Reform Act of 1832, the Second Reform Act of 1867 expanding voting rights. The elites, often fearing revolution if they didn't concede something, chose gradual reform, which further strengthened the rule of law and the inclusive nature of the system.
And we see something similar in the U.S. with the anti-monopoly movement.
We do. The U.S. started with relatively inclusive institutions, but then faced the challenge of the robber barons in the late 19th century. Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, Morgan building huge monopolies. But because the political system was pluralistic, movements like the populists and progressives could organize and push back. This led to landmark laws like the Interstate Commerce Act and the Sherman Antitrust Act.
Which were actually used.
Yes, presidents like Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson used them to break up some of the biggest trusts, like Standard Oil. It shows the system, because it was politically inclusive, had a way to correct itself and prevent economic power from completely overwhelming political power.
Even FDR's attempt to pack the Supreme Court fits this.
It does, in a way. Facing resistance from the court to his New Deal programs during the Great Depression, Roosevelt proposed adding more justices who would be favorable. But Congress, including members of his own party, pushed back. They were concerned about undermining judicial independence and the balance of power, core features of inclusive political institutions. Even though some New Deal laws were later upheld, the attempt to fundamentally alter the institution failed. The system protected itself.
Okay, so that's the virtuous circle. What about the flip side? The vicious circle.
That's where extractive institutions perpetuate themselves. Extractive political institutions concentrate power in a narrow elite. This elite then uses its power to create or maintain extractive economic institutions that enrich them, often by suppressing competition or exploiting labor.
And that wealth reinforces their political power.
Exactly. The economic wealth extracted then funds their ability to maintain political control, maybe through force, corruption, or controlling the media. It locks the system in place.
The post-Civil War American South seems like a stark example.
Tragically so. Slavery was abolished, yes. But the old planter elite largely kept control of the land and political power at the state level. They then created new extractive institutions. Jim Crow laws, segregation, poll taxes, literacy tests, specifically designed to disenfranchise Black Americans politically and keep them as a source of cheap, controlled labor, particularly in agriculture. Political exclusion reinforced economic exploitation, which reinforced political exclusion, a classic vicious circle.
And this pattern repeats elsewhere. The book mentions post-independence Africa and the iron law of oligarchy.
Yes, the iron law of oligarchy is this idea that power tends to reconcentrate, even after a revolution or independence movement supposedly aimed at liberation. The new leaders often just step into the shoes of the old elite and operate the same extractive system. Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe is a painful example. After leading the fight against white minority rule, his ZANU-PF party took over the existing, quite extractive state institutions in 1980. Over time, he crushed opposition, consolidated power, and maintained economic controls that benefited his allies but stifled broader growth. When his popularity waned, he launched the chaotic land seizures, destroying property rights, wrecking the agricultural economy, leading to hyperinflation, all to maintain power. An extractive regime replaced another.
And Uzbekistan.
Another clear case. After the Soviet collapse, Islam Karimov, a former communist boss, took power. He established a dictatorship, crushed dissent, controlled the media, banned books. Meanwhile, the population, especially in rural areas, faced things like forced labor in the cotton harvest for incredibly low pay, while Karimov's family and the new elite connected to the old communist structures became enormously wealthy. Extractive politics supporting extractive economics, reinforcing the political power of the elite.
It paints a pretty bleak picture if a country gets stuck in that vicious cycle. But the book does offer some hope, some examples of countries breaking the mold.
It does, though it stresses how difficult it is. The prime example they discuss is Botswana.
Right. How did Botswana manage to avoid the fate of so many of its neighbors in Africa?
It's a fascinating story. Unlike many other post-colonial African nations, Botswana has maintained a stable democracy since independence, held regular competitive elections, and built reasonably inclusive economic institutions protecting property rights, managing resources relatively well.
What made the difference? Was it just luck? Diamonds?
Yeah. Diamonds helped fund development later, but the authors argue the foundation was laid earlier. A key factor seems to be Botswana's pre-colonial traditional institutions. Specifically, things like the Kagatla, which is a kind of tribal assembly where adult men could participate, debate issues, and hold chiefs accountable to some degree. These traditions of consultation and accountability weren't completely wiped out by colonialism.
Why not?
British colonial rule in what was then Bechuanaland was relatively light, kind of indirect rule. They didn't invest much, but they also didn't dismantle these traditional structures as thoroughly as happened elsewhere. So these institutions survived. Then you had the leadership of Seretse Khama leading the independence movement. His name, Seretse, apparently means the clay that binds together, which turned out to be quite fitting.
And the diamonds? How did they avoid the resource curse?
This is crucial. Before the big diamond discoveries, Khama and the post-independence leadership made a critical decision. They passed legislation vesting all subsoil mineral rights in the nation, not in specific tribes or elites. This meant when diamonds were found, the revenue flowed to the state, not just to one group. This prevented the kind of conflict over resources you saw in places like Sierra Leone with blood diamonds. Instead, Botswana used the diamond wealth relatively effectively for state building, infrastructure, education, things that reinforced state capacity and supported more inclusive development. It's a rare success story built on a combination of surviving traditional institutions, good leadership at a critical juncture, and smart policy choices.
So wrapping this all up, prosperity isn't just about having resources or a certain cultural background. It seems fundamentally about the choices people and societies make about their institutions, the rules, formal and informal, that govern how they interact.
Absolutely. From ancient Rome through the Industrial Revolution to modern states like Uzbekistan or Botswana, the patterns are remarkably consistent. Inclusive institutions foster broad participation, innovation, and sustainable growth. Extractive institutions concentrate power and wealth, stifle innovation, and often lead to stagnation or collapse.
Understanding these dynamics, these virtuous and vicious circles, the importance of critical junctures. It's not just academic, is it?
Mm.
It really helps explain why so many efforts to fight global poverty have maybe missed the mark by focusing only on aid or technical solutions without addressing the underlying institutional problems.
Exactly. It highlights why institutional change, which is often messy and comes through political conflict and demands for broader participation, is so often the prerequisite for real, lasting economic development.
It definitely gives you a lot to think about. For you listening, what stands out from this? How do these ideas about inclusive and extractive institutions change how you look at success and failure around the world today?